Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome, everybody. Glad you could join me tonight because this is a very, very special one. We have back with us one of my favorite authors, and I certainly have read more of his work than I've read of probably anybody else, though there are only 2 books out there that I'm familiar with. I've read one of them at least 3 times, so it counts as a lot. He is a master of his field. We have Gary Wayne with us again. Of course, most of you know him because of his books, Genesis 6 Conspiracy and Genesis 6 Conspiracy Book 2, Part 2. But tonight we're going to go into a little bit of a different field and yet cover it in a similar manner. Gary is a Christian contrarian who has maintained a lifelong love affair with biblical prophecy, history, and mythology. His extensive study has encompassed the Holy Bible and Gnostic scriptures, the Quran, the Gita, Gilgamesh, and other ancient epics, language, etymology, and society publications, secret society publications. He's been around and he has so much knowledge inside of him. I'm afraid he's going to pop someday. But until he does, we've got him here. Welcome, Gary.
Yeah, so hopefully I don't pop. That would not be pleasant sight, but
no, especially on the air. Don't do that. Although I would have the as you know, as you see it happening here. So that would be.
Yeah, I mean, it would be must watch video for sure. I think maybe, it's a good thing I do talk shows and communicate with people a lot so I can get what's on my mind out there as opposed to staying just inside. So probably that's the best safety valve we have.
Well, you've been on the show that I can count at about 25 times. You have your own playlist.
Wow.
So that if people fall in love with you tonight, as I'm sure they will, they can go to my YouTube and there's a playlist of all of Gary's shows, and there are 24, 25 of them there. And I never get tired of listening to you. I always learn something, and I learn stuff that I can actually utilize and throw into a lot of the other interviews that I do. So you have been a mentor, and in many ways, you have also been someone who has challenged me to do better and know more. And in my family, knowing more about the Bible is fabulous. I've actually managed to challenge a couple of people and win. So
excellent.
All thanks to you.
Yeah, well, that's what we want Christians to do, is to learn more and to be able to challenge so that we know why we believe what we believe and what is we can back up and what we can't back up. What's speculation? What isn't speculation? And I think in this day and age, We have to do much more of that.
Well, my philosophy with the show is that if I can make somebody think,
Exactly.
that they can agree or disagree. I don't care. But
Yeah.
if they are made to think and go out and research a little bit on their own, my work here is done. Well, not totally, but the fact that somebody's brain is now functioning in a form of, let me check this out, as opposed to, okay, that's the truth and I'm not going to challenge it. In the Bible, Jesus says someplace challenge everything, and
Yeah.
it's a good
Well,
idea.
well, and I think one of the best things that Paul has for a testimony, when he's talking about Jesus and the new covenant, he's being challenged by one very sort of relatively unknown people. They're called the people of Berea, and so they're the Bereans, as I would call them. And the Bereans checked out everything he was saying based on what was in Scripture to verify that it wasn't heresy or wrong. And so we're only talking about the Old Testament. So when Paul is talking about everything for the New Covenant and the New Testament, they're holding him accountable to what does the Old Testament say on that. And so I try and encourage people to be like a Berean in everything they do, so that they can't pull the wool over our eyes, because people, they talk without being able to back things up a lot of times. And
Yeah.
a lot of people out there are just trying to mislead people, because usually there's some sort of gain or a benefit for them to do so, whatever that benefit is. A lot of times it's money, but so we want to be able to challenge people and to be able to talk intelligently, because it's easy to say something if you're not challenged to back up what you're saying.
Well, I think, I know people who will throw chapter and verse at you, but if you
Yep.
suddenly say, what does that mean?
Yeah,
They repeat chapter and verse.
they
They
do.
can't they can't
They do.
they can't tell you what it means,
Yeah.
but
There's a big difference between memorizing passages and understanding the passages.
exactly.
And always try
Exactly.
for the latter, because you can always look up the passage.
Yes.
You can't just look up the meaning if you haven't grasped it. And another thing I like to do is when they're quoting passages, it sort of politely sort of gets them into a position where they're a little bit uncomfortable, is, have you considered these passages, because that doesn't really line up with what you're saying.
Oh, I'd like to just sit and listen to that kind of conversation. You call yourself a Christian contrarian.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
You have two levels. So I think I've been a contrarian all my life, and I come about it in two different ways. Ends up really in the same spot, but for my motivation is, I don't tend to accept what somebody says, what they say something had happened, and whatever other sort of testimonials that one could put with that, I will consider it interesting until I can verify it myself. Or I ultimately trust the person that I think he would be conveying the truth. Whether or not they were being lied to or not is a whole different story. But again,
Yeah.
that's another reason why I would want to verify things myself. So I do everything like that in my research, whether it's inside the Bible or outside the Bible. And so I want to verify what is commonly understood, myth or fact, or truth or not truth. And so that I can be comfortable with what I believe. And inevitably, whether it's biblically or otherwise in this world, I tend to be at odds with the world. I'm sort of swimming upstream versus going with the flow, which makes me a contrarian, which generally a contrarian is defined as. So I call myself a Christian contrarian, because I challenge a lot of the status quo within Christian dogma, not to be heretical in any sort of way, because I think all scripture has to complement itself, and I believe it's the word of God, and I don't believe it can be in conflict. So I look to sort out those conflicts and then try and explain that to people in a different way, saying you can go along with it just on faith. I don't have a problem with that. I'm not built that way. But
Hmm.
there are so many passages in the Bible that people outside of Christianity and not Bible fans will say, and they tend to be better experts on it than Christians are, because a lot of them are like from secret societies and organizations like that. They will point out these passages to seed faith issues within Christianity to try and get them to fall away or not have complete faith with what's written in the Bible. So I think it's important to be able to take those challenges on and resolve it in a way that does not create any other conflicts in the Bible.
Well, when we were talking about what more could we talk about, you pulled up the topic for tonight, and I have to admit, Tolkien I'm very familiar with. Not his personal life as much as the books that he's written. And Lewis, I had not read his Narnia series as a child. Don't know how I missed it. But so for the last 2 weeks, I've read all 7 of the books.
Wow.
And
That's a lot of reading.
well, I told you I always really do prepare.
You do.
So I Christian or Gnostic moles.
Yeah.
That's a great topic.
Yeah. It is, because so many Christians, not so much Tolkien, but specifically Lewis for one reason or the other. Lewis is said to be a great Christian writer. Tolkien is said to be a great writer, not necessarily Christian, although he professed to be Christian as well, just as Lewis did. And that so many Christians hold Lewis up on a pedestal. And so it's risky when I started to challenge back on what are the fruits of their writing.
Mhm.
What are they talking about Christian things, or are they talking about something completely different? And Tolkien and Lewis have a common a nexus point where they meet each other for the most part and learn their skills together at Oxford, at a society called the Inkling Society that we'll talk about later. And so they're writing in the same sort of style, which is what they call mythopoeic, and it's a Greek term for basically meaning just writing and creation of myths, and it's for a specific purpose. And again, we'll probably talk a little bit more about what that actually is. But they wrote in the same type of genre and were both wildly successful because they were great writers and they
Oh
wrote
yeah.
great narratives. Whether or not you're a fan of one or the other, it doesn't dispel that they're very good at what they did. But we should understand their literature for what they're trying to sort of convey. And so when you read either one of those, do you say, am I reading monotheist doctrine? And Christianity is part of monotheism. Or am I reading a polytheist inspired book? Or am I writing some sort of reading something that is sort of secular of this world, of a history that is long forgotten? What are we actually reading? And we should understand it in that way, because particularly Lewis's material in the Narnia series, I mean, it's read to children. They read it all the time.
Yeah.
And so it has a tremendous influence. And as you get a little bit older, Lord of the Rings, the most famous ones by Tolkien, becomes very, very popular with the older, children as they get into the teenage level, and some even before. And all the movies that have been done on their works,
Yeah.
and how they've defined that fairy mythology is absolutely extraordinary. So much so that they, reinvented a style of writing that was renamed sort of mythopoetic. Poetic. I always want to put the T in there, and it's not there. Mythopoeic, and it should be um, understood as part of an ancient sort of style of writing, because it comes out of the style of Greek writing that was done in ancient Greece. And it was a style of writing that was to make a record of ancient times, but in a way that it wouldn't get lost. And as you're trying to do a record of ancient times, and in Greece, that's all polytheism. And they're talking about their gods. And they're talking about the ancient heroes, which is giants. And this is all about sort of prehistory, even though Lewis's writings isn't as obvious and relating that, but he has other books that he's written as well, other than Narnia. But Tolkien is for sure, absolutely, without doubt in my mind, recording a narrative about antediluvian or pre-flood history, but
Yeah, I
not
can.
from
Yeah,
a monotheist perspective.
yeah. I read the Tolkien books. Well, for pleasure years and years ago. And then I read them again for pleasure. And it was probably the third time through that I started to see that there were messages beneath and behind the story that I hadn't really noticed. You know, the moral lessons that were there, and good over evil
Yeah.
and all of that. Now with Lewis, I never read them as a child. I read them as, well, I don't know. I'm almost at a place where I'm in my second childhood, so I could almost say that. But I got the enjoyment of the story, but I also noticed the moral lessons that were beneath there and woven in. So they were both writing basically to the same audience, teaching moral values to a generation, each in their own way. Was this something that they got together and said, there's no books for this age group, we got to write something? I mean,
You
was
know,
it that easy?
I think it was an updating of that history for a new generation. What's different than some of their writings, even though they looked at other people who were doing that other, kind of style of writing, like Charles Williams and MacDonald and other ones. Actually, MacDonald was part of the Inkling Society, but an older member of the Inkling Society. And so, yeah, I think it was an updating, but they took that writing to a whole new level. I mean, there's a society of mythopoeic writing that's out there to this day. So when we look at this mythology that they're creating, we need to understand that they built it on certain premises that took it to a level that I think that the generation that they were writing to, and still appealing to our generations being born at this point in time, is they were creating stories and narratives based on ancient history, but more than ancient history, the religion that they had, the gods that they worshiped, the heroes and the genealogies that were passed down. And they were creating a new narrative to hold that history for people who understood the allegory. And I know they would, both Tolkien and Lewis would say, to call their literature just allegory undervalues the level of the style that they were actually doing. So it's not just an allegory. They're using allegory, and they're using more modern scenarios and places, but it is that mythopoeic style that they like to call it. So it is an archetype for holding history, and typically understood by people who are learned in the polytheist religions.
Well, I can see with Tolkien that, I mean, to me, his stories are almost interdimensional,
Tolkien?
where, yeah, where,
Yeah.
where, where Lewis is, definitely more the here and the now.
Well, but actually, if you look at it, that world is entered through a closet and a portal.
Yeah, true.
So it's there. It's just not as in your face, but it's there because of the traveling back and forth and to these different worlds or different dimensions.
Well, yeah, and it also is the ending of one world, beginning of another.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but I found that after having read the Lewis books, I could see the comparison. And
So
wh- what is the real message that they're trying to get across? Is it opening up of the potential for higher levels of consciousness? What is it they're both aiming at something, and I was having trouble trying to figure out exactly what their point was.
I think they're preparing young people for ideas that will come to an externalization of the hierarchy, as they like to call it, in the end time. That it is preparation to accept things that maybe they wouldn't be as easily accepting of before. So if you look at, Lewis's 7 books of Narnia, that's a very interesting number. Now, from a Christian perspective, well, that's like a week. It's like um, a number of completion, right? And so everything seems to be pretty fine with that, except that there's a term that the Bible talks about and is understood in polytheism as these wandering stars. There's 7 of them. And those wandering stars are fallen angels biblically, and they're the gods of the pantheon and sort of the main gods of the pantheon that are used in, these are the same gods that are used in the days of the week. It's the only difference with what's going on with the days of the week. They're using Greek, Roman, and Norse pantheons for the various gods and goddesses that are in the days of the week. So Lewis's books actually follow that. So, book 1, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, that's after Jupiter. And there's imagery that is going to be understood in Jupiter. And I'll just sort of go through it. And, the Prince Caspian is Mars. And Voyage of the Downtreader is the sun. And the
Mm-hmm.
silver chair is the moon. And the horse and his bay is Mercury. And these are all sort of understood as part of the 7 wandering stars. And so
But
the
he
whole,
didn't have he didn't have 7 books to start with. He had to do that first book to tell
yeah,
people how Narnia started.
yeah. But what he did was he used that whole polytheist ideology as an overlay for the series that he was going to write. So there you have
Okay,
imagery that comes out in each of those books that's relative to those specific 7 wandering stars.
this is true.
Um,
Yeah,
so
no,
it's brilliant literature, no doubt about it. But my question for people is that polytheistic or is that monotheistic? And it is definitely sort of monotheistic, and that I think it's fine to read the literature to the children, but in a teaching manual, or if they're going to read it, you want to be able to talk to them on what many of these allegories are so they have a better understanding of the world. I'm not here to burn books. That's not what I'm just
no.
trying to arm people for the world that we live in.
Were both of these authors Christian, or and what's their background that brings them to this table, so to speak?
Yeah, it's a good question. And just so that people, I did miss 6 and 7 on the books. Just Venus is the magician's nephew, and
Mhm.
Saturn is the last battle. So just to name those off, and I won't go into the details. I'll leave that for other people to go into deeper on that if people want to go into it. But just understand that's the overlay, and that's written in the history of Lewis is that's kind of a basis for what he was using with the imagery within those different sort of worlds and worlds run by the gods. So yeah, so both of them profess to be Christian. With Lewis, he was raised in a Christian uh, family, left Christianity, and at age 32 came back to the Anglican uh, branch of Christianity. And so in 1930, at the time of entering into the Inkling Society and being hooked up with Tolkien, he makes a conversion as well. So that's why when we use the term Gnostic mole, is that's where they're going to learn their craft. They're not going to learn about fairies. They're not going to learn about ancient heroes and God. They already know that knowledge, and we'll come back as to how that was maybe down the road, but they're there to learn a writing craft.
Mm-hmm.
And so Lewis begins writing the Narnia tales, beginning and publishing in 1949 for book one. So this is well after he became a Christian. So 20 years later, he's writing the Narnia series. And people say, well, he converted again. Well, I don't know how many times he converted, but he's still writing and bearing fruit of polytheism, which is fine. I'm not against polytheism. I have a different belief system, which is monotheism. But what I find curious about both of them is that I can find no record where they ever denounced their writings.
Okay.
And that to me is something that's rather interesting in terms of if they're Christian and if they converted after their writings at some point in time, I could accept that. I would like to have a written record of that. But
Mm-hmm.
I would also prefer to have saying, I wrote some really great things, but those aren't necessarily Christian. We don't get that from either.
Well, who's to judge? I mean, certainly if you're working with polytheism, then it's pretty clear. But just because you write it in a flavor doesn't mean that reflects your flavor.
Well, it's true, but when you're writing to glorify the pantheon of gods, that's polytheism,
Yeah.
right? And they're not denouncing the polytheist gods; they're actually raising them up to be superhero type status, right? When you sort of look at it that way. So again, what happens with, and I talk about this quite regularly on the shows and a little bit in book one, is that mysticism comes out of the seven sacred sciences and the knowledge imparted by the seven angels in Enoch, or the gods around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Same sort of idea of the seven wandering stars, this illicit knowledge. And this is the religion that Cain picks up as well. And as being the father of Enoch, son of Cain, who's going to create this mystical religion of a sun worshiping and bull cult. And what's important to understand is they have four goals within mysticism. One is to lead people away from God. Two is to not give God credit for anything. So we don't get God referenced in these books.
No.
We don't. We get a reference as Jesus as he might be on another planet as another animal, which is as an incarnation, which is not a monotheist doctrine.
No.
But we don't get them mentioned sort of directly in any way. And so they don't want to. And the second thing they don't want to do is give God credit for anything. So he's not in it. Third thing is to degrade God. I don't see a lot degrading God here. I just see the elevation of the polytheism. And the fourth thing is to honor their pantheon of gods in everything they do, whether it's in building, whether it's in writing, whether it's naming things after them. And that's the emphasis that I would point to in this writing, is it's honoring those pantheon of gods and their spurious offspring.
Yeah, especially in the Narnia book. I mean, it was more obvious in the Narnia book than in the Tolkien book to me.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's there in both, but it's in spades in the Narnia book, especially with Lilith and Jada, that is linked back as that bloodline, or Jadis, I mean, is linked back as that bloodline to Lilith.
And Bacchus.
And Bacchus, yeah, and Bacchus is a satyr or satyr goat god. But so is Mr. Tumis as a fawn or a devil.
Mm-hmm.
And there's lots of satyrs and fawns because they're the same type of creature which are fallen angels, that are characters that are not exactly as they're understood or remembered as to what they did in Greek history. And I won't go into all the things that those goat gods did. But there are giants in these tales. There are elves and little people throughout this. I mean, the whole thing is polytheist history. And I'm not saying that none of these existed. In fact, I think they probably did.
Yeah.
All of them. But it's how they're being glorified that we want to sort of understand, just so that we can distinguish that. This is, for the most part, a very interesting narrative with some really important characters that actually existed and were perceived as very good people within those polytheist religions, but were totally sort of disaligned with the idea of Noah and Adam and Seth and the teachings of monotheism.
Well, with every book that's written, the author has a message that they're trying to give to the reader.
Yeah.
And certainly the moral values are here all over the place. They're the moral lessons are here. But I wonder if you had to sit each of them down and say, what was the point? What was the purpose? What
Yes.
were you teaching?
Yes.
What would they say?
Well, what they would say as to what they would believe might be two different things.
Yeah.
I think they might say they were just trying to write good stories and entertaining narratives. But I think what they would actually say if they told you their true beliefs is we want to keep our history alive, our religion alive, and we want to keep it always out there. And so here's a quote from Lewis's own autobiography by Joy in 1955. It's not a long one, so it says, Theosophy, Rosicrucianism, spiritualism, the whole Anglo-American occult tradition. Oh, I'm sorry, that was not part of the quote. It says, and that started me in something which on and off I had been, this is speaking of when he was a child, on and off I had been plenty trouble since the desire for the preternatural, simply as such passion for the occult. Not everyone has this disease. Those who have will know what I mean. And he later described his youth as being paradoxically angry with God and not existing. And by the age of 15, saw religion as a chore. And so, but he did supposedly convert back to being Christian when he was 30. But he never said that that disease ever left him.
Okay. I mean, I can see that there's a message here. And I can see the moral values that are being taught, understand those brilliantly.
I think
But
we can better understand their writing if that we sort of look at maybe how they view the Bible.
okay.
So both of them, both Tolkien and Lewis were on the same. They both spoke to this topic, and they said that, uh, and Tolkien sort of publishes it first, but he says in an essay on fairy stories that the Gospels were nothing more than fairy stories,
Ah,
right? And they're mystical stories, and that the Gospels contain, and here's a longer quote on it. It says, the Gospels contain a fairy story or a short story of a larger kind which embraces all the essences of fairy stories. They contain many marvels, peculiarly artistic, beautiful, and moving, mystical in their perfect self-contained significance, and among the marvels is the greatest, most complete conceivable eucatastrophe. But this story has entered the primary world, So it's a fairy tale that has now become fact, as they would call it in their
Mhm.
writing. So it has entered the primary world. The desire and aspiration of subcreation has been raised to the fulfillment of creation. The birth of Christ is a eucatastrophe of man's history. And they both describe the Bible as a fairy tale with a eucatastrophe. What's a eucatastrophe? Well, it's a term that's coined in their style of writing, and people will know this, that this has a more ancient sort of history to it, because it's the understanding of what a fairy tale is that has always ends with a happily ever ending story or an ending, so that everybody walks away with a good feeling. But what they call is the eucatastrophe is that happily ever after ending is to avoid the realism of the tragedy for the reader. And so instead of going, and if you understand Greek sort of history and mythology, all of the great heroes came to tragic ends. The Greek tragedy, right? That's where that whole thing comes from. Uh, and just as you have the other style of the writing that is rooted in satire with satires. So it's interesting how these words sort of come down through our history. But this saving the hero in the story from this tragic ending, they apply to Jesus so that he didn't die. And to understand the Bible, you have to understand the allegories in their belief system. To understand the fairy tales, you have to understand the allegories. You don't understand the allegories unless you're a mystical adept in polytheism. Then you begin to understand the true meanings to the story. So they look at the Bible as a fairy tale. So does Freemasonry. And so they will adopt Jesus into the Gnostic belief system, but as a mortal prophet versus the Word of God, Son of God, and that he didn't die and that he wasn't resurrected. So, I mean, he would have had a mortal death because they look at him as a great teacher and a prophet, but not deity status. Um, so you start to get an understanding that their belief system, how they look at the Bible, is the interpretive polytheist approach, just as they come out of the interpretive polytheist belief system.
Right. So basically, it feels like both of them were polytheistic, even though um, I think most writers probably are, even though they don't actually claim it. They may have a foundation of Christianity, but they may have just gone a little beyond that.
Yeah, I think when we look at most entertainment, I won't say all because it would be
Yeah.
not true, but most entertainment, I think, is controlled by the polytheists and the secret societies because they're talking about the same types of belief system. And when you mention good versus evil, that's part of polytheism. And within polytheism, they have white hats and black hats as we understand them today.
Yeah.
You know, black magic, white magic, evil witches, good kings, good giants, bad giants. It's this perpetual battle within of the white hats who have humankind's better interest at heart versus the dark hats, which will have us destroyed sooner than later. They have the same belief system, same agenda, but how they get there is a little bit differently. It's kind of like looking at AI and saying, one's calling Mr. Musk calling Google's AI evil. And so my response to battle that is I'm going to create good AI. But the end, we all know how that ends. It's kind of the same sort of understanding. So I think when we look at how they seem to control a lot of the entertainment, whether it's Hollywood, whether it's literature, whether it's the media, we should see similar types of characters, right? It just
Hmm.
sort of makes sense that they would control it. And if we look at how they controlled society throughout history, it's the nobility that populates the top two classes that control the whole educated class, which would include the arts, right? And what's interesting is that Rosicrucianism is the sponsor of the Inkling Society. It's a Rosicrucian organization at Oxford that they're going
Okay.
to join. And what's odd when you look at it, and we'll probably come back to this, is how do two people not thought to be of great wealth or nobility get to Oxford, let alone a Rosicrucian society, because that's a lot higher up than first level adept. But the Rosicrucian Society is a society that influences entertainment and keeps the history alive and the religion alive. That's their main goal. So when we look at um, um, Williams, Charles Williams, he is an Inkling, but he's a Rosicrucian. And he's the one who brings Tolkien and Lewis into this writing society at Oxford. But I think only to learn the writing craft versus already having this knowledge. And so the Rosicrucian Society is the Golden Dawn Society that sponsors the Inkling Society.
Golden Dawn is oh, what's his name?
Crowley, Aleister
Crowley,
Crowley.
yeah.
Yeah, that's his organization. But it had many years of sponsoring writers. This was just one of their branches. So famous Golden Dawn writers included Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula.
Yeah.
Same kind of style, right? When you start to think about it. A couple other names that people might be familiar with other than Williams. Evelyn Underhill. There's, Arnold Bennett. If you're not, not well read, don't worry about it. But it's
T.S.
just
Eliot.
T.S. Eliot is probably the most famous of those ones. And so they had a lot of generational, they had stables of writers that were active. And this is not an unknown organizational structure. So if we were to go back to another famous Rosicrucian, there's an interesting fellow named Francis Bacon, who was mentored by John Dees. And Francis Bacon wanted to reinvent the English language from Middle English into the New English, or the KGV English that we would understand it, to become a universal language for what he was hoping and had a dream of this empire of England that would eventually become the Commonwealth. So he creates two writing societies to do this. And those two writing societies are the Knights of the Helmet Society and the Spear Shaker Society. Now, if that sounds oddly familiar to William Shakespeare, who is also said to be a member of this society, and that is very coincidental, I think people would be accurate. And the Spear Shaker Society goes back to Apollo and to I'm trying to come up with the Greek goddess that was with them, but it'll come to me. I'll bring it up later. She and he held a spear as a weapon, and they shook that spear when they wanted to use it, to use the power of the spear, and that's where that spear shaker term comes from. And just as importantly, they were the Greek god and goddess that sponsored the arts. So that's why he named it after that. Athena is the goddess that I was looking for. So this is a writing style that eventually was the language that was going to be used in the KJV Bible, and this is also the same style of writing that Shakespeare wrote. Again, all about their history. So what are you going to see? You're going to see these royal bloodlines. You're going to see these little people that show up, like in Midsummer's Night Dream.
Yeah.
You're seeing the same kind of history in the new language of that time to keep their history alive and front and center. And this is the same style of writing that the ancient Greek writings that came out of Greece and also out of Rome were based on. This is an ancient style.
in a way, though it feels like today, people are trying to do away with that style.
Well, are they? I mean, Harry Potter
Oh yeah, good.
would be certainly within that genre, whether or not she's completely sort of established as mythopoetic or not, I don't know, but you would have to look at that style of writing as the same thing.
I would agree with you on Harry Potter for sure.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that what's coming out literarily doesn't have the same flavor to it that or magic to it.
Well,
That
that's that's the genius of the writing of Tolkien and Lewis is they
yeah.
could write such terrific narratives that were, just almost like put a magic spell on you with interest. And I say that allegorically. Um, but I mean, they just hook people on it with that great style of writing. But, Harry Potter was close to that, but I would say still below.
Well, I think too, the times have changed what people are looking for in their literature as well.
Yeah, I would say that that's accurate. Yeah.
I mean, I know Harry Potter swept generations, and I was so sad there wasn't another book. There, she's done spin-offs, but I was ready for Harry Potter to be the head of Hogwarts.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, and that may yet happen.
Yeah. Who says she's done with the writings? So, and what's interesting about her, I mean, just sort of off topic a bit, is that she went to 100 publishers who all turned her down before the last one actually, took her on. And, he took her for lunch, as the story goes, and they were talking about it and said, basically, for a publisher, children's books, they lose money, which is why they don't want to publish it. And
Mhm.
he says, I'm not going to make any money on your books either, but your writing is so darn good, it has to be published. So I'm going to do it, but I'm going to lose money doing it. Well, that didn't turn out to be true, but
Yeah,
that so, and for, writers that are out there, understand that it's very hard to get published, so don't give up.
that's true. All you need is one person to say yes.
Yes.
So definitely. But these guys didn't have any trouble. These guys were the elite, though. They
Yes.
weren't just
Yeah, they
a
weren't.
normal person.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to be educated at Oxford, and especially back then, you're going to have the
Yeah.
doors opened at any publisher that you want. And particularly if you were trained to do that writing through the Inkling Society, right? You just had a resume that is sort of beyond anything. So people are probably, I mean, I don't know how many people who went through that society who didn't get published. I doubt not many. How
Well, were
successful
they
they might have been are two different things.
were they all in the same genre? I mean,
Yes.
fairy
Yeah.
tales and things like that.
Yes. It was all the same style of writing. Yeah.
How much time was there between these guys and the Grimm brothers?
Oh, that's probably 70 or 80 years.
Because the Grimm brothers had none of this magic.
No, and weren't necessarily done in England as well. It was, done, as I recall, originally in Germany. Now
Yeah.
they may have been revamped and sort of rewritten, but there's a longer, older history to those writings that were updated into the fairy tale genre. So if people haven't thought about the word inkling, I'll just give people something to sort of think about, because I wonder, why is that society named Inkling? If it's a secret society at Oxford, how did they come up with it? Because they like to honor everything that they do and hide everything in plain sight. So it means a slight understanding in its superficial level, or a hint of
Yeah.
something. sort of creates an interest into something deeper, something underneath. And that's what inkling means. And or in the Old English where it comes out of, it was to utter with an undertone. So almost coded, right?
Yeah.
Allegorical, whatever, however you want to do that. And so occult literature provides an inkling, a hint, an undertone to the occult and the hidden knowledge if you can learn the mysteries and understand the allegories that are embedded into the primary narrative. That's the fairy tale.
Well, I think in both of these situations, there is that element of the magic that is there. And it's, you know, in one book, well, you know, in both books, there is that element of magic because once the children went into Narnia, time stood still, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
It's the other world. It's like
yeah,
um, Peter Pan story where you never grow old, right?
yeah,
It's into this other dimension. And again, same types of characters and imagery. It's just what Lewis is doing is putting it into a different setting, but it's the same sort of story. And the underworld is where the gods live in polytheism. It's Hades or Sheol or Argata or other names that are around the world. And so it's in another dimension. Um,
mhm,
and this is where all of the ancient heroes were trying to get to be with the gods. And part of the whole reincarnation thing of the demigods in terms of their religion. So again, it's a completely sort of polytheist thought. And this is where the immortals live. That's why time stands still. Time is irrelevant to somebody that's immortal.
well, yeah, and time was sleeping in Narnia
Yeah,
until the very end.
yeah,
Yeah, no, that was I didn't like the ending, but
yeah. Well,
especially
and it's to make you think.
yeah,
But if you can't answer the question, believe me, the people who have been educated in polytheism as adept levels, they would understand um, that whole sort of allegory, and it is kind of obscure for sure. I mean, why was time sleeping? It's saying it's an individual, like Father Time, and Father
yes.
Time shows up, but as a different character, kind of character within the Narnia tales. Whereas a giant or Father Christmas would be understood as the same thing, just as the um, head of the gods, particularly of the Satyr gods, the horn gods, were known as Father Christmas, as we understand that as with a Christianized term. It's usually um, Father Mitra is how you would better understand that. So that Mitra is the god of Zoroastrianism, a god out of the giant polytheist religion, and Mithra
Mhm.
was a popular religion at the time of Rome, particularly with the army, and it was a branch of Zoroastrianism. And Baphomet, that the Templars worship, that means Father Mitra.
Yeah.
And so Odin is recognized as Father Mitra, as the horn god. Cernunnos in the Druidic pantheon would be understood in the same sort of understanding as a satyr god. And the Etruscan equivalent to that would be CERN, C-E-R-N, sometimes K-E-R-N, pronounced Kern. It's transliterated both ways, and that would be Bacchus, the Romanized term for Bacchus as well.
Yeah, I
But from the Etruscan pantheon. Now, what's interesting is that Indo-Aryan language is the word meaning for this god is actually K-E-R-N and C-E-R-N, which means a horned-headed god.
okay. Well,
So if
I
you,
know that
okay,
there was a time when I took the Greek gods, the Roman gods, the Norse gods,
yep,
and just, you know, listed them out. And just they were all the same guys.
They are. And that's why you can use the 7 days of the week with 3 different pantheons. But if you know anything about polytheism, you know what the counterparts are. You know, it's like you have Thor as Thursday, right? Out of the North pantheon.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not too hard to make the comparison as to, you know, where that's going to be within some of the other pantheons. And Freya is another one of the Norse, and that's basically just another mother goddess within the other pantheons. And so I won't go through all of them, but it's a standard religion that once was everywhere in the world, probably still is if you look at it,
Oh
that it
yeah.
may not be as visible as in the West as what it may be elsewhere, but it's the ancient religion. It's ancient religion that restarted after the flood, and it's the same religion that was before the flood.
Well, I know that in some place in the Narnia books, they had somebody who 6 months here and 6 months there, and that's Persephone.
Yep.
And so I was seeing, the correlation between the two. Well, not between Tolkien, but between the Greek and the Roman gods, and
Yeah.
what Lewis was pulling from. It was fascinating to wondering why he chose a lion.
Well, yeah, it's a good question. Is it because Aslan
Yeah.
is how Jesus would be incarnated in another world on a different planet. So Aslan is this lion, and it's a great double entendre because Jesus is the Lion of God biblically, right? So he's picked something really
Okay.
good. But Jesus is not an incarnation, which is a polytheist term, and Jesus became flesh, but an incarnation, and there was no spirit within the body and soul that was implanted by the Holy Spirit within Mary. He comes in to that soul to be his oiketerion, dwelling place for the spirit in the physical world to complete his mission. No sex
Mm-hmm.
involved, no other spirits involved in terms of inside who Jesus is. So it's the Word made flesh. And I got these two terms connected from Strong Cyclopedia that you had sent me years ago.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and with Avatar, I wanted to know a little bit more about Avatar. Could I find anything on it? And it had it, and it classified the two terms as Avatar and Avatara.
Oh.
And Avatar is, and these are polytheist terms, and an Avatar is a god, and an Avatara is one who receives that god into them. It's similar to a possession, but unique. It's more symbiotic. So Vishnu, where this concept is most famous in the Hindu religion, incarnated like 20 times. And the most famous one that he incarnated into was Buddha, who and provided the wisdom to create Buddhism. Right. But there's
Okay.
already a spirit in there. So they're sharing that oiketerion, that dwelling place. And so it adds into it. And biblically, we know this can be done because Satan enters into Judas in the same way to give him courage to go on and betray Jesus.
Yeah.
Right. So we know this effect can happen sort of biblically. So who else did Vishnu become the avatar for? Well, depending on which account you're reading, there's two gods that are associated with Aslan. One is Shiva, which is a destroyer god that also avatared 12 times, but also Vishnu. So whichever one you pick, I don't care which, it's the same idea, but in this case, it's likely Vishnu. And Vishnu is the avatar for Aslan.
Ah. Okay.
Now, when you look at that as a incarnation for the end time in polytheism, you're going to have Mithra coming back as that God, Father God, and is going to incarnate in the end time. So when we see the term Lord Maitreya as the Gnostic allegorical name for the coming Antichrist that coincidentally starts in 2025 for that period, according to Alice Bailey.
Yeah.
Lord Maitreya is Lord Mitra, right? Who's going to incarnate. I mean, these terms just keep coming up all the time.
Yeah.
And so he's going to incarnate into Antichrist as the Christ consciousness, as the New Age understands it. So he's going to receive his power from this chief god. And just as Antichrist receives his power in 2 Thessalonians from Satan and in Revelation 13 as well. So there's a crossover effect here that's used for Aslan. And also, what's also interesting in that crossover, and if you remember, I said Shiva, which is the destroyer god, which is likely equivalent of Abaddon and Apollyon, all destroyer gods, likely Azazel, who is the chief of the Watchers, put into the pit prison, according to the book of Enoch. He is associated with Antichrist as well, because Antichrist in Revelation 17 is the one who once was, now is not, but will be again, and comes up out of the pit prison. And he's also the one who comes up out of the pit prison who kills the 2 witnesses at the midpoint of the last 7 years as well. So there's a relationship between Satan and with Azazel, just as there seems to be this relationship with Aslan, with Shiva and Vishnu. And I don't think that's coincidental. So you have this hiding of polytheism under a Christian understanding of the allegory of the lion and Aslan, with Jesus as an incarnation on another planet. And so this is just their version. It's very similar, it's nuanced, but if you don't know the idiosyncrasies and the nuances to what they're talking about, it sounds very convincing.
Was the Inkling Society the only secret society that the 2 of them belonged to?
Probably. So, and the reason why I say that is I think they were way above Rosicrucian level of adepthood. So how it works in polytheism with the adepts is and in the old system, it's first level adept is 3rd degree. Most people understand that as the Scottish degree of Freemasonry at 33rd degree, but the old system is the 3rd degree. If you're going to oversee lodges in Freemasonry, you're going to be 5th degree on the old system, where kind of the Illuminati sort of hangs out. And above them are the Rosicrucians. So what are the Rosicrucians? 6th degree, 7th degree. And this is a Rosicrucian society, Golden Dawn, that is sponsoring the Inkling Society as a Rosicrucian society. And so we don't have any records that says they're part of Freemasonry, probably because if they were, it was just ceremonial but not meaningful, because in polytheism, if you are a royale, you are initiated from childhood, and you are going to be adept before you're 18 years old. You're not allowed to take an adept title somewhere between 25 and 30. So they would have been raised to higher levels as if they were royales, by being initiated from childhood. They're not there to learn the knowledge. They already have the knowledge. They're there to learn the craft, which is why they show up. So if we look at, were they royales, and most people say they were kind of commoners, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's not really true. And which is how they show up in Oxford. So I mean, Lewis's father is Lewis Albert from Belfast, but they moved from England to Ireland. So his grandfather Richard is the illegitimate son of King George IV.
There you go.
Yes, and his family line of Lewis, and he's obviously taken on the ancient name of Lewis, because the ancient Lewis, as you take that back into time from, let's say, before the 1500s, that's going to be the Llewellyn name that's out of England and Wales. And this is Llewellyn of the Great Gwynedd, dynasties and the Prince of Wales region. And Gwynedd kings rose to be the kings of Britain. So the whole name, I won't go through all of his sort of bloodlines, but there's a few different variations, but all of it goes back to Tuatha De Danann bloodlines, like King Arthur had, like Uther Pendragon,
Yeah.
and Guinevere. And Lu derives from god Lugus, which was the Pan-like god that we were talking about earlier. Again, these satyrs and things, they just continually come up throughout. And there's variants of it, Lu, Lug, and Lug. And Lugus derives Lu, which derives the Llewellyn name. I won't go into the other side of the name, but I did a complete sort of ancestry listing, and then I traced different names and tried to get meanings and where they went back to. And so Tolkien's a little bit different. Now understand that Tolkien, his version of this is a different fairy version than the Celtic version. Similar but different. It's a Norse version,
Okay.
right? And so Tolkien, his family moves to England, and they're thought to be commoners and poor, but somehow again ends up at Oxford. So how does that happen? Well, he's got a very long bloodline that actually goes back to Odin and Thor. So, and how that happens, he comes over with Rollo, his family, the Tokes.
Yeah.
Son of Tok is what Tolkien means. So Tok comes over with Rollo in about 910 to 912 BC as they invade Normandy, which is the name is named after the Norsemen. And they expropriate Normandy and the settlement that they make with the French, and that the Rollo bloodline is going to change their name to be from Rollo to the treaty that it signed under, which is St. Clair, is the name of the treaty. And they become the St. Clairs that are associated with the Templars, the St.
Yeah.
Clairs with Freemasonry. These are the families of Rollo that come over as the nobility. And then as you trace his, they don't move over. His Tolkien's bloodline doesn't move over to England in the Norse invasion. His branch sort of goes to Germany and then back to England later, but it's the same sort of bloodline. So as you look at, there's several different variations as you see Tolkien show up in English names, but the short story of it is that he's of Norse Odin royal bloodlines. And so what he does is he's now more interested in his family line version of the same history in terms of the cultural aspects and through Odin, versus Lewis, which is more interested in the Celtic Irish versions of the Tuatha De Danann.
Yeah, I can see how the two, the backgrounds like that, I can see how they play into what these two men wrote.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And people will say, well, like, so when we look at these groups of people that are called fairies, they're called elementals. In the occult, and elementals have three groups of little people. One's good looking, one is mischievous, and the other group are quite ugly. Three different groups. So leprechauns are mischievous, right? Groups in the ugly ones would be like gnomes, trolls, yeah. So, and these are the same three groups of the little ones all over the world, and they're all created by the gods in these various pantheons. So, in the Roman pantheon, Diana is the queen of the fairies, right? She's associated with them, and also associated with the Tuatha De Danann. The other group of elementals are the salamanders. They're a reptilian being that a little bit larger than humans, and their elementals are at the bottom level of the hierarchy. So biblically, just so people know why I'm going through this little bit of explanation here, is that we're told in Galatians that We are enslaved in this world by the elementals. Now, elemental, stoichian is the Greek word. You can translate that as a basic element of the world, of the physical world, which it's used that way as well, and from the same word, but its alternate being is some sort of spiritual being, as you get that back through Strong's Cyclopedia and through Strong's Dictionary. And so when we look at Colossians, these are also called rudiments that enslave us into the world, but it goes back to stoichian, so the same type of being. And so we have the biblical reference to this lower level hierarchy of these little beings that were created by the gods. And now we have, okay, we have an intersection of the Bible and the world, and we should maybe take these little creatures a little bit more seriously, particularly as you get into the alien mythos, and
Yeah.
you have the gray gnomes, which look like the grays and do the same things that the grays in the alien mythos do. But so when we look at these beings that are in Lord of the Rings, and also we get all these little people and also giants in the Narnia tales. So for giants, um, you have like Father Time and Father Christmas, which are terms that we already used and used them in a different. But these were names for giants. There's other giant names in the Narnia tales
Yeah.
for the giants that are in there as well. So, but when we look at the Norse one, you have these white elves. Dark elves are part of the ugly ones, but the white elves are good looking ones, but they're not part of the good looking ones. Why? Because they're bigger. So when we see the white elves in the Lord of the Rings, they're good looking, but they're much taller than the elves. So this is actually an allegory for the elven bloodline of the giants, right?
Yeah.
The Elbigens. And so they're not shown to be giant sized in the Lord of the Rings, but they would be the giants. So you have these very pale white skin. In this case, they're going to be red hair and blonde hair, blue eyes and green eyes, just as they're shown in the Lord of the Rings, mostly the blonde version. But there are some redheaded ones in there as well, because they were thought to be a little bit more pure model. This is the two more pure branch. This is the Tuatha De Danann fairy people. The fair folk was
Okay.
the allegory, was the offspring of Diana or Danu, and or Anu as the parent as well. And in the fairy mythos, they're created by the the followers of the proud fairy who came to the planet from other planets and then created offspring amongst the humans that were here as well in the prairie mythos or the fairy mythos. All the stories are identical, and we see these characters show up as archetypes of this ancient history. And if people don't think we can place where that whole story is designed to be located, at the end of the trilogy of the Lord of the Rings, you have this really interesting scene where all of these beings, except for humans, are leaving on a ship on water because now it's the time of man. It's an allegory for the flood. Doesn't mean that they're not around anymore, maybe in different dimensions, but it's a different epoch. And it doesn't mean they're not coming back, but you have to understand the sort of allegory. And so they're sailing away. This in a Norse understanding and in an Egyptian understanding of going on a boat to the other world, right? But still alive.
But the hobbits stayed.
Yeah. So hobbits are quite small and they live in the earth. They're part of the ugly ones. So in the book of Ezekiel, we have these gamad beings, gamadim, as they're said to be in the KJV. I don't know whether it's a direct reflection or not, but they're in the towers of Tyr during the time of Nebuchadnezzar. And gamad goes back to Hebrew to meaning a cubit.
Okay.
So a cubit is 18 to 21 inches high. These are little people.
Yes.
And we have records of, smaller people, but as a distinct sort of being that's not sort of a derivative of a physical nature from humans, these were distinct beings. They're gamadim, and the I am in ancient times were part of the bloodline, of a royal majestic bloodline. So when you get seraphim, cherubim, those are angelic beings. Ophanim, it means a male plural and as one. So seraphim would be the serpent ones or the dragon ones as dragon angels. If you have Nephilim, it is the giant ones. If you have mighty ones, is Gibor and Gibborim in the plural. So this is a bloodline distinction coming from the gods with the I am plural. So Horim would be another tribe of giants as it shows up in the KJV, or the Anakim. I'm just giving ones where you actually have the I am majestic version shown in the Bible. And so these beings are not of a human source with that I am plural as they were listed. And so I think when somebody says, like you just said, well, the Hobbit stayed behind, I'm thinking other ones might have stayed behind as well. And certainly you have stories all over the world, whether it's the First Nations of North America, Southeast Asia, they talk about ones that never went to the other world as well, that still live in the forest and among us. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Well, it certainly gives a fuller understanding of what these guys put out there.
Yeah, it's kind of eye-opening and quite jarring for people to hear this. But it's important to understand. But it's a bigger thing than just what they wrote. We talked about Harry Potter. Well, you can look at almost any entertainment that's in the fantasy genre, and they're pulling from the same knowledge. Now, it's not done at the same level that Tolkien and Lewis might work at, particularly a lot of the Hollywood productions. But again, it's the commonality of the genealogies that are embedded. It's a combination of the same types of beings, the same types of gods. It's in the superhero narratives that we have all over the place. It is perpetually reproduced and kept in front of us all the time. You know, even if you go to university, you're going to see everything in the universities that is reminding you of polytheism, not secularism that they propose, because everything's named after the gods and the heroes throughout the sciences. They use architecture. It's changing now on some of the newer universities, but most universities have Egyptian, Greek, Roman, or Babylonian architecture on it throughout, right? And those are all to honor the pantheon of the gods of the beast empires that rule this earth. And so even if it's on a space mission, you have, you know, dragon ships, you have Apollo, you have Mercury, you have all of these things that are named after the gods. And on the university campuses, you get degrees. Just as mysticism is a knowledge religion, and the more you learn, the higher degrees you get. So now you're in this 7 liberal arts location, which was called the 7 sacred sciences, that produced mystical religion, and you wonder why God isn't permitted anywhere for discussion or creationism on those campuses. Well, they're doing the same organizational and agenda approaches they've done all throughout history. And now you're into a degree system. So they're swearing oaths all over the place, because it's, when we look at the, I know I'm off on a bit of a rabbit hole here, but when you look at the creation of the secret societies, they take their creation back to before the flood, to Enoch and that bloodline, and to the creation of the mystery schools as an extension of the mystery religion to educate the elite. And then they would set up secret societies to develop specific aspects of the 7 sacred sciences. Masonry is the 5th science, geometry. So Freemasonry, ancient Masonry, is derived and specializes in that seventh science. So they take their beginnings back to then, and we see the same thing on campuses to this day. So the simple ones are the ones that are just there sort of to give it some sort of sense of non-threatening um, groups that they can do, other groups that they can do their real agenda with. So let's say Alpha House, Beta House. But now you move up to the Ivy League, and the most famous of these campus societies is the Skull and Bones,
Yes.
right? Which is a branch out of the Thelemic Tree um, organization of the Illuminati,
Yeah.
and it's for the bloodlines.
Do you think on some subliminal DNA level, this foundational material is within all of us to be drawn to it, to manifest it on some level?
I think so. I think so because what education has not done for us, it hasn't provided our history properly.
No.
And they're giving us a sanitized, limited version. And our whole state of being is saying there's more to it than this. There's more to it than when we die, there's nothing. They're not offering us the real answers. They're giving us tiny bits and pieces, but not giving you the larger picture from before or what's going to come after.
And yet,
So I think we have that longing for it.
well,
And what they did before they started to educate us or permit us to be educated, they left us absolutely illiterate and ignorant and
yeah.
desperate to understand that. And then you're only going to be able to reach out with things that are made available. So it's easier to lead people astray. So they have to work harder through the education process to lead us away from God and then into polytheism.
Well, you look at today, I mean, you've got your Greek, your sororities and your fraternities,
Yep. Yeah, it's all
all
there.
based, oh yeah. But Skull and Bones is still there too,
Yep.
only for the elite though. They're
Yes.
very selective
Yep.
as
And
to
and there's
who can come in.
and there's different levels of that selectiveness as well. So yeah, so not everybody who goes to university gets invited, because you have to be invited, just as you have to be invited in Freemasonry to join. You have to be of the bloodlines to join.
How do they tell?
Well, they have genealogies.
Well, yeah,
And then
but I mean, you can't tell me that in some dark closet, somebody's sitting with a computer checking out on ancestry.com to see how far back somebody's
well,
line goes.
well, yeah, I think that's accurate. So maybe let me sort of restate this is
Okay.
you will have parental influence to have you join these groups, but you still have to be invited, and then you have to go through their tests and whatever
Yeah.
else. So it's a bit of a combination. So, and before 1970s, we had no real computers anyway. So how did they track this?
Yeah.
Well, the the churches tracked all of those genealogies. And if you infiltrate Christianity, as they have, they tend to be the elders and the leaders of the churches, and particularly with the Roman Catholic Church, they would get access to this. So they would be looking for those people. They would have people assigned to do that sort of research.
Well, when it comes to the leaders today, um, they appear to all have quite a genealogy,
Yeah.
which is a little frightening.
Yeah. Why do they have all of that? And the commoner has to go through
Yeah.
all sorts of things to try and figure out our genealogy back even 200 years, right? And you can do it, but it takes forever, and then you get to crossroads where you're not sure which way to go to follow that genealogy. So they've kept this bank for their records. And so the New World presented a lot of new challenges. So they had to come up with a different scheme. And they are a believer in the legal system and possession and legality of property. And they like to control all of the property. So the system that was set up in England is, 1% of the population own 99% of the land, right? That's how they were able to maintain the nobility for such a long period of time. So, and this was common in all of the royal
Yeah.
kingdoms, right? So when the New World was being settled and you have new city centers being established, they had to find a way to get control of that. So they would take families who have multiple siblings and they would send some of those in waves as the expansion was going on to work their way into the ruling class with so many other ones that were working there who would know who they are, and they would start to sort of set up this uh, layman's cabal sort of unit. I don't want to get the Jewish connotation in there, but this sort of secret society that they would
Yeah.
bring with them. And so they wanted to be able to control every town, no matter the size, and then control it as it went. So what they would do is they created the town square, which is very famous in the New World, less famous in the Old World, which it has such old cities, but it's very common in all of the new cities in the New World. They created the town square concept. That concept is based on, if you look at a Masonic hall, the windows in there, they have this 4 quadrants. It's like a cross in there, and that's the town square with the emblem that's laid down. So on the north and the south poles of that square, of the town square, they would have a legal building. It could be a courthouse, could be a police station, it could be anything to do with legality and government. But they would build it. So typically fire stations, things like that, depending on when the town was built. And then on the east-west, and preferably they would have on the west a Roman Catholic church that they controlled, and on the east a Protestant church. But if you had 2 that they controlled, that would suffice. But ideally, that's what they would do. And so I thought when I learned this, well, maybe I should check out my own hometown. It was created, in the late 1800s. So but I already had the visual, but I had to go actually see, does this line up? And so we had a fire hall on the north side along the river, courthouse on the top of the hill on the south. We had a Roman Catholic church that actually I was, married in on the west, and then there was a St. Paul's Church, a Protestant church, Anglican church on the west side. And so it was there. And so they took legal tender over all of the cities and had control of all of the city councils, and that was their legal sort of possession. And they would do rituals and things to make sure it was all part of their belief system, and they established this all the way through. It's a common thing that was set up, and everybody just takes a town square for granted, and they have no idea what it signifies.
Well, my town square, where I was born,
Yep.
there's a church on one corner, a school on another, the library, and then town hall. Not 2 churches, but
Yep.
but when you were describing it, it was like holy mackerel.
Yeah.
Same philosophy.
Same
It's all right
philosophy.
there. It's
Yeah.
all right there.
Well, and it's, a library would do just as well in a lot of cases because it's a knowledge, religion,
Yeah.
right? So
Now, was that subliminal? Does that happen subliminally, or is this a conscious, intentional act that is happening?
yeah, it's done on. It's different in every size of the town square, but they have sacred geometry and relationships to the positioning and the distances. Now, typically, what they also did was they would build tunnels underneath those locations.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where they did most of their secret rituals. And then what they also like to have is a water source somewhere in the northeast quadrant, so that they could do some evening special rituals at certain times of year.
Now, this is basically towns that have been founded in the 1800s, right?
Yeah,
Or is it,
yeah,
or is it,
and early 1900s too. You know,
wow.
not that many were founded, long after the 1900s, but um, yeah, and so they would be continually sending people over. And that's also why you had the Masonic halls that were populating within these town squares in all of these new towns and working as part of that organizational structure.
Is this obviously it's still ongoing, but
Yeah. To what degree, I don't know, but what
yeah,
they
that's
have
where I
is
was.
what they have. So it's, transition probably more towards what happened in Europe, where after a period of time, you're not developing new towns. So now you're just in how do we maintain control and keep hidden.
Well, that's the keep hidden part. You step back and you take a look at it all, and it does make one feel as though we're being pawns in a game and we don't know what that game is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet you can see the maneuvering that's going about within governments and cities, that it's almost as though it almost feels like we're repeating a pattern.
Well, and really we are. And so whether it's polytheism or monotheism, and I'll use the monotheism version, and it becomes obvious to see that that's understood on polytheism as well. But there's a passage in the Bible in Ecclesiastes 1 that says, "Nothing is new under the sun.
Yeah.
What was will be again." And the understanding of this as you move on to that only brings grief and sorrow. We're living in a repeated cycle. And so when you look at the importance of the flood, that's in all cultures all around the world, is a major dividing force of
Yeah.
a timeline, and talking about the same event. You had this destruction by water, and now you layer into the Gnostic and Freemasonic and Masonic accounts of this flood story, where they knew destruction was coming. They just didn't know it was destruction by fire or destruction by water. And so in their legends and their myths, in the legends of Enoch and or Lamech, they're the same story. So pick your poison as to which one did it. But they wrote information on two pillars,
Mm-hmm.
um, some important information, but more importantly, directions to where they were going to store their accumulated knowledge and technology. Um, and in their lore, and this is all allegorical, of course, because they use numbers and all sorts of things to do with the starry host in their allegories. 36,000 um, and 36,000 and 25 36,025 books for all of this knowledge. And that's obviously a solar number, right, for the solar calendar. And they hid them in 9 vaults underneath the Great Pyramid. Now, interesting what's going on at the Great Pyramid today, that's showing a lot more things that are there. And this is the knowledge that Hermes found and took back to the Tower of Babel to start reactivating that religion and knowledge. Now, these two pillars, one was made so that it would survive a flood, so it would float. The other one was made to survive fire, which, until I put the connections together, made no sense to me. But that's what they chose to do, because they didn't know what kind of destruction was coming, water or fire.
Yeah.
Well, they had technology that we're just catching up to this day that could destroy the planet by fire. It was taught by Azazel, taught all of the arts and crafts of war. and the angelic technology that merged with the 7 sciences. So I think God either permitted the gods to bring the flood, because they bring the flood in polytheism. So God either brings it or permits it to prevent the world from being destroyed by fire, because nothing is new under the sun, and here's why. And it's an intercession to allow more time. In 2 Peter 3, it's talking about this planet that was destroyed by fire, that was in the water and out of the water, that perished. Well, most people think it's talking about the flood. Well, the whole world didn't perish.
No.
Just what was on the land. So what's it talking about? It goes on to say that this destruction by fire has been reserved for the end time. And we know the end time in the age of Aquarius is destruction by fire. So what it's telling us is that 2 things. One is that this destruction by fire was prevented because and we know that because the polytheist testimony shows they didn't know which destruction was coming. So they had 2 pillars to find this lost knowledge. And then you have this destruction that likely happens between Genesis 1:1 and 2, just as 2 Peter is talking about in the beginning, when the earth and the heavens were created, or the heavens and the earth were created. And so if you had a destruction by fire, let's say in an angelic rebellion, then you would have destroyed the earth completely with that capability down to its foundations. And that we're told in the book of Job that foundations can't be destroyed. They're forever, but the earth could be renewed, as Psalms 104 talks about. When God sends his Holy Spirit, the earth is renewed. And so if you destroyed the foundations, the earth down to its foundations, then the waters that were above, that are used in the renewal of the earth to separate the waters below from the waters above so that life can live underneath the firmament, those waters would have collapsed down onto the earth because of this destruction by fire that happened in the beginning. So nothing is new under the sun. And they're trying to bring about the same end result in this showdown with God and another war, which has been reserved for the end time. And so, yeah, all of this is happening again, and all of the beast empires were trying to bring about the end time. So one deduces, if nothing was new under the sun, there must have been an antediluvian Antichrist, like an Atlas or like an Orion, somebody like that in all of the different accounts, or King Sudra, perhaps, in the Vedic understanding.
But you still have one pillar.
One pillar that had the directions to find the knowledge. That was the key.
Where's the pillar?
Well, it was kept by the secret societies, and it was around in the time of Pythagoras, who they say read from it.
Really?
And had access to some of the ancient knowledge. So this is in the age when mystery schools are quite plentiful. So one deduces that either Pythagoras, at some point in time, after he'd reached this great level of being a teacher of the sciences, traveled to go see it, and it was on, or he actually may have had possession of it. It's hard to know which, but he's associated with it, and having seen it and read from it. So there's a history of secret societies keeping lost treasures right from the beginning, just as the Roman Church also started to do, when they came about, and store underneath the Vatican. So who knows? Maybe they got a hold of it and stored it there too, as well. I mean, we don't know. But the 2 greatest storehouses of ancient knowledge and artifacts are the Masonic societies and the Catholic Church. So one of them probably has it.
Just seems to me as if there are indeed, I know they've found that there are definitely chambers under the pyramid.
Yeah.
And the Egyptian government theoretically won't let anybody dig because they don't want to collapse it.
So,
but
yeah.
But it seems.
Go ahead.
But it just seems to me that that we're at a period of time here. It's like the tomb of the last emperor in China. They're saying they don't want to dig it up because they can't handle the mercury that is involved
Yeah.
in the land, so
Yeah,
they're afraid to dig it up.
that's the reason for sure. Yeah,
Oh
not.
yeah, I mean, really,
Yeah,
but but
but
but
it's being kept for a reason, and the pyramid has such a great legend and mystery to it, and we get the story that it was built by either Khufu or Khafra in 23 to 2400 BC, but it's probably renovated, and that's a time that's associated to just after the flood from a biblical chronology. So that sort of makes sense from that it would be renovated versus built, and that in the time of Menes and or Narma, or in the stela of Menes and Narma, they're the same king, just different names, Ed, multiple names. You see in that, in the background of this 52-degree slope of the Great Pyramid, and that's dated to 2950 to 3050 BC for that stela. So it's older. We have records that it's older than what the seculars are telling us or the
yeah,
Egyptologists are telling us. Also, it's thought to be built on not only astrologically aligned to the stars, and Orion in particular, but also significant other relationships to the Earth and the Moon and a whole bunch of other things that people should not have been able to do in the standard sort of chronology,
yeah.
and that it was built on a ley line, according to the Gnostics as well. So, an energy source that's natural to the world. So, the theory from a polytheist side, in some polytheist accounts, is that it was some sort of power energy generator as well, that had significant technological capabilities, of which has been lost, but it needed this great energy. So now you see pictures of what they say is being discovered. I don't know whether it's true, but it almost looks like there's some sort of energy factory or creator with these tubes and things that are underneath it, and who knows what else. We're also told there's a temple in there somewhere as well, or space for a temple, or an archives of the Masons, as they would call it in their belief system, where that knowledge was stored, the ancient knowledge. So in the ancient times, the pyramids and the towers and the ziggurats were thought to be for the same purpose, or describing the same, or maybe there's nuanced versions of the building of it. Who knows? What we do know is they're used for the same purposes, and that this is the tower that is also now being built by Nimrod, who is the inheritor of this knowledge. And he's going to do, whether it's in the book of Jasher or it's in the accounts of Josephus or other accounts that come from other cultures, Nimrod, he uses this tower that's being built to climb up top on and do grandiose speeches, as an antichrist person would do, as an antichrist archetype and wannabe, that if God ever got out of line again, he was going to build this tower so he could enter into heaven and kill God if he got out of line and like brought the flood or something like that again.
Well, yeah,
Well, he'd
but
have to
but
be a madman to say that, because you can't do these bricks or stone and get to another dimension. But if it's a technology,
yeah,
there's more going on. So in the Akkadian version, Babalu, as it was called, for the Tower of Babel, was understood in the Akkadian version versus the Hebrew as being confusion of languages. Babalu is Bab as in a stargate or a portal, and
yeah.
ILU is the same as EL in Hebrew for an angel or a god. So a portal or a stargate of the gods that could go into another dimension. So that it's thought that these things were to be able to go into, another dimension. And now we're starting to see some discoveries. Who knows where it leads? That actually might put some detail and veracity into some of this history or mythology. I guess we'll find out sooner than later, hopefully, as to what actually they found this time underneath, and whether or not they're going to release the whole information. Who knows? But we should not discount everything that's recorded in these various myths and legends and history around the world, because more often or not they're proven true. Just as the Bible, the more they go, is proven true.
Oh yeah, well, with the Great Pyramid, they said that the Nile did flow much closer to the pyramid, so
Yeah.
that water could have gone into the lower chamber. So it
Yep.
definitely could have been a generator of some sort.
Yeah.
But without the capstone, um, it's 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 not working.
Yeah. And you
But
just look at how people use pyramids as sources of energies in the
absolutely.
and so there's that. I mean, that's living. That's a mythos. That's ongoing. That there has to be more to it than, and whether it's all true, it's not really important. But we know there's a bunch of important information in there that's been kept through the generations. To dismiss those things is to sort of deny our history.
Well, and big parts of it too. I mean, the fact that there really have been with ground penetrating radar, they have identified chambers.
Yeah, I know.
And the big thing was what they did discover a huge void in the pyramid itself, and the speculation as to what was buried in that chamber that was above the grand causeway, that they made such a big deal about who it was and what was there. And when they finally did look into it, it was empty.
Yep. Yeah, I know. It was all a distraction. I mean, and what those chambers are used for, I have no idea. But not, I mean, these weren't burial sites of the pharaohs. There's no
No,
pharaohs. They were all buried elsewhere, right? So makes none of it ever made any sense.
I
So
mean, it was not ever, there were never chambers for um, personal objects or anything
no,
like that. This was definitely not meant to be a tomb.
yeah, and understanding that there's more underneath is important, because it's a standard again amongst much of the great, very, very, very ancient sites. Like, Gobekli Tepe has more underground
Oh,
than it has above.
yeah.
S-
But look at the Sphinx. I mean, the Sphinx is older than the pyramid.
Yeah, it is.
So
Or,
that
or maybe not. Maybe they're built at a similar time.
maybe, but I mean, the watermarks there
Yeah.
are awfully clear.
Yeah. We
So
get
it's some,
watermarks on the Sphinx, but not necessarily the pyramid.
yeah.
I would certainly, you know, um, agree with that. Yeah, absolutely.
So it's going to be very exciting, isn't it? If anything comes out, I
Yeah.
just, and you mentioned Gobekli Tepe again, another site that was buried. Why?
Yep.
It wasn't buried by time. It was intentionally buried.
Yeah. Yeah. For what reasons? And why was an underground city built?
Well, look at Derinkuyu
Yeah.
in Turkey. That was what, 13 levels deep. That could have
Yep.
housed 5,000 people
Yep.
and animals. I mean, why?
What's that famous city in the desert in south of Lebanon where the Edomites lived, and um, it was in one of the Indiana Jones movies. I'm trying to think of it. Very famous city, but most of it, what we see between those cliffs where the riders ride in the movie, and you get these great openings to the doors.
Petra. Petra.
Petra, that's what I'm looking for. Yeah, meaning rock. Most of it's like 80% of it's underground. Like
Oh,
we only see a
absolutely.
small piece of the facility. So why would they build that? And we look today what's going on, And we see more government underground shelters. We talked about underground places in all of the towns that were set up. You get under Paris, there's so many tunnels and
Oh, yeah.
underground structures there. Why were they built? I think it's got to do with the same things that happened in the past. That's there for protection. Is it protection by water or for protection by destruction by fire or both? We don't know. But they were designed to hold significant amounts of people and to protect them. So why? Because
Well,
and
there
we're
are
doing the same thing today. So
well, definitely there are cities being built underground now, tubes between the East Coast and the West Coast that are being utilized. So, we're doing the same thing, and why?
yeah,
It isn't because we don't want to clutter the surface.
no, and it's not. And those locations are not known to most of us, and we're not going to be invited to go
No.
there for whatever reasons they're being built. That's for the elites. Notice the word "el" in there.
Oh, God. Well, when you stop to think about it just because your bloodline means you're part of a family doesn't
Yep,
mean that you have the same political aspirations
yep, that's true.
either. So,
And it doesn't
so
mean you'll be chosen to be spared if those are protection locations.
I have often thought that they were using genealogy and 23andMe to gather samples of DNA to hunt people down.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, sure they were, and the name says it itself, I think. So, I mean, if you look at the Paramount logo on the mountain with the 23 stars, right?
Yeah.
Those that's the imagery of Mount Hermon, and the original 23 that are talked about in the Book of Enoch. So 23 and Me, these are the ones who produce giants, and this is a genealogical
Oh,
company.
geez. Yeah.
Like they hide everything in plain sight and show their imagery and genealogies
I
and who
wondered
they
where the
believe they are.
23, yeah, I wondered where the 23 came from.
Yeah, the celestial mafia godfathers.
Oh, gosh. Well, you certainly have enlightened us. There's no doubt about it. 23, damn. I never caught that.
Yeah, sometimes you have to really sort of dig, and they're very good at nuances on things, right? And sometimes they're quite obvious, and sometimes they're very, very nuanced on some of the names that they
So, what does the 23 relate to?
fallen angels.
Gotcha. Wow. Son of a gun.
Yeah, just as a star is an allegory for an angel biblically,
Uh huh.
same idea, same number, genealogies, spurious offspring.
Well, I don't think I made it into the final
Yeah,
count, but
yeah. And if people are saying, well, why is it there are only 23 that they're concerned with? That has to do with the council of the gods in the realms that they control. And there's 70 of those gods. So they're referring to a specific 23 and specific bloodlines of the 23. And if people haven't heard me speak, and I mentioned one of the gensas, these are gensas from the gods. And so, gens is part of genealogy, right?
okay.
And, and Plantagenista, the Plantagenet comes from. And so Albigens was the one that I was referring to, and that's part of the Norse bloodline and part of the Windsor bloodline of the Albigens. And Albigens, goes back to Latin as being white as an Albi, pale, hoary, words like that, and gens, genealogy to a specific patriarch. So the Albigens of the Elven bloodline of the Tuatha De Danann is a specific patriarchal bloodline. So there are other bloodlines. So we had mentioned the Etruscan pantheon earlier, and we mentioned um, some of the gods. Understand that Mars is the god of war in the Latin pantheon, and he'd be a different god of war in the Etruscan pantheon that the Latins inherited. But Mars would be the equivalent to Ares in the Greek pantheon. So Romulus and Remus are the offspring of Ares. And Romulus and Remus produces the 100 bloodlines of the senators of Rome. You know, you have the Fabia gens, you have the Julia gens. Those are all genses of that bloodline, of that part of the black nobility. I'll give one more just so that people understand. And by the way, Albion was a giant that LB is associated with, just as giants were very pale colored skin, right?
Yeah.
Albion was um, an offspring of a parent god named Iapetus before the flood, just as Gog and Magog were offspring of that particular giant. That's part of the LB gens. So a lot of the names of the LB gens, they'll have names like Albert, words that would be a derivative of ALBI. So look for that as you're looking in through some of the royales. It helps you in terms of their bloodlines. And there's one other one that's really important. You have something called the credigens. And just shows you another one of the bloodlines. Credigens, credit comes from the Semitic word Keret, K-R-T, out of the Ugaritic text for this island of Crete. And Zeus spent a lot of time on Crete. And of course, after the flood, there's significant giants that are there that I cover in book 2. You have the Casualheme, the Cherithim, and the Pelatheme that the Philistines lived amongst before moving into the Middle East, just before the Exodus. And so Zeus produced a number of bloodlines. One of them was the Herculides Gyges kings of Assyria and Anatolia and Greece. And the Gyges Herculides kings comes from Hercules, who's the patriarch as a giant after the flood. And Zeus, through the human female Alcmene, produced Hercules.
Oof.
They track these genses all over the earth.
Are they trying to round up their prodigies?
How do you mean round up?
Are they trying to identify them? Are the people from that particular bloodline, are they looking for bloodline people?
I think they always are. I mean, as they sent people around the world, particularly from the Europeans, you get a lot of, generation to generations, you're going to lose some people, right? But they're
Yeah.
always looking to sort of bring them back into the fold if they can, based on their genealogy. So that's one of the things that Freemasonry does, all around the world, but particularly in North America, is they're out looking for people to invite into these secret societies, like Freemasonry, to reintroduce them and see whether or not they want to come back into the fold or not.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Have they looked into, for instance, the people who are politically in office now? I mean, have they looked at their bloodlines to
Oh,
see?
sure. So, I mean, so many of the presidents, and I don't know how pure Trump's are. I've not done any on that. I don't think it's all that pure. Some people say Obama went more back to the Egyptian bloodline. I don't really have anything to substantiate that. But before that, and there's been studies done on this from, Bush and before, they all go back to the Plantagenet, which is that
Yeah.
Plantanagista original family. And they are a junior offshoot of the Anjou. And the Plantagenet that they all go back to is King John of the Magna Carta. Not King Richard, his brother, but to Probably both. I think they're just kind of been conflated over time, but the standard version, it all goes back to King John for some reason. And they're a junior offshoot of the Anjou. And the Anjou, they're one of the primary secret society bloodlines that have contenders for an Antichrist at all times. And in fact, the King of Jerusalem title through intermarriage is currently held by King Philippe Bourbon of Spain,
Mhm.
who inherited that through the Habsburgs, through the Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty, but all through the Anjou bloodline, and currently holds the King of Jerusalem title. Now, the von Habsburgs are saying that should never have passed on to them, so they have a claim on the Antichrist title and King of Jerusalem as well, not recognized, and also the bloodlines of the Anjou of Italy as well.
Wow.
Savoy is the House of Savoy. So,
Incredible.
yeah.
Wow. Well, I just noticed our time. You've given me a lot to think about.
Yeah,
Um,
and again, I just want people to understand that I'm not here to throw rocks, uh, um,
yeah.
but I think we should try and understand the world that we live in a little bit better, and that we are continually provided propaganda that may or may not be what our belief system is. Um, and so we should understand the meanings in the history that's in here, and particularly as to how we make it available for our children, and then how to explain that to them in a way that makes sense. I'm not saying not to watch any of it. A lot of people would say that. I think that if you have the armor of God on and you're well prepared, you can look at a story and have it as a good story. You can also understand more of what the motivation of the
Yeah,
producers of that story were trying to convey.
absolutely. Before we go, can you let people know where you can be found?
Absolutely. So the best way to get a hold of me or to find me is on my website. Um, and on that website, there's a contact the author icon. On the website, I have a generous excerpt of both of my books of each chapter. It's just a small drop of what's in each of the books. So, but it'll give you a good feel. And I think just the table of contents will probably grab your interest. If you wanted to support me, I don't take donations. You support me by purchasing one of my books, and you can go to the Buy Now page to get a signed copy. And I have 3 buy pages now. One is for book 1, and there's multiple discounts for multiple books. Book 2 is page 2. Page 3 is the bundling page that I had added in December on my last revision, so that if you want to buy one of each or multiples in a mix, all you do is go to that page and you can bundle that any way that you want and still get the discounts. If you
Mhm.
wanted to purchase from Barnes & Noble or Amazon, that's the easiest way to link over to Barnes & Noble. And Amazon is right off of that buy page. I have links there. I have links for the digital Kindle versions on Amazon, and also for the Audible version on each as well. And the Audible versions came out late last year, and they're still doing very, very well, running top of a number of genres. So they pop up and down a little bit. Last 4 days, they've all been number one again. So happy with the production of the Audibles, and that people are um, buying that format as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I got to thank you for again blowing my mind. It's always fun to have you here.
It's enjoyable to work with you, and to get into areas that other people normally might not get into, and from the perspective that you come at it, which really sort of adds a lot to the conversation. So it's I may be producing some new information, but you've got so much knowledge on these things that I think it usually produces a very entertaining and informative show.
Whoa, definitely for me. Thanks for my education. You're my PhD. Um, but I will get in touch with you, and we will certainly, absolutely find another topic that we can get into, because there's no way that we have even skimmed the surface of what you've got to share.
Yes. Always more to talk about.
Thank you again, Gary. Good night now.
Good night.